This time it's 6 motorcycles with V4 engines. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit that bell button. Now there are lots of different engine configurations, parallel twins like my BSA, big singles, across the frame 4s, even across the frame 6s, but nothing quite has the panache of a V4. Whether it's a Grand Prix racer or just a plain old road bike, the V4 engine is a touch of class. And so here's 6 classic examples. The AJS Grand Prix bike. In the early days, AJS had indeed been a pioneering company. But by the 1930s, they were under the ownership of Matchless to form the Associated Motorcycles conglomerate. While they would later turn to Badge Engineering, in the early days of the 1930s, AMC were very keen to give their new acquisition an identity of its own. And to that end, at the 1935 Olympia show, the company would show off its first iteration of the V4, and this early version of the engine would be a single overhead cam air-cooled unit of 495cc. And while it was initially intended as a road bike, it never actually saw production. Instead, a racing version was introduced in 1936, which featured a supercharger and produced around 51 horsepower. But unfortunately both it and a much improved version released in 1938 would suffer cooling problems. But despite their problems, AMC did not give up on the project, and instead commissioned Matt Wright, formerly of New Imperial, to do a complete redesign of the engine. The resultant machine was a V4 with overhead cam, but now with thermosiphon and water cooling, to hopefully cure the overheating problems. The machine ran a supercharger running on 0.4 bar, which gave around 55 horsepower. The engine was installed into a new duplex frame with plunger rear suspension and twin leading shoe front brakes. But unfortunately this was a very complicated beast, and with war looming, AMC didn't have much time to develop it fully. In its first outing in that year's Northwest 200, the bike flooded on the line and didn't even get going. In the 39 TT they had slightly better luck, but the machine didn't handle well and blew head gaskets in practice. They would finally finish a disappointing 11th and 13th. At the final Grand Prix before the war, the Ulster Grand Prix, the two V4s led from the start, hitting a whopping 135 miles an hour on the main straight, completing his first lap from a standing start, remember, at just over 100 miles an hour average. But unfortunately neither bike would finish. One would foul its plugs, while the other would suffer suspension damage. Now many think that that was the end of the story for the V4, but it would return post-war, at least briefly, winning in Chimay, Belgium in 1946. But by that time its replacement was already in development, the parallel twin Porcupine. The Porcupine was a much smaller, lighter machine which was much more nimble. Like the V4, it was intended to use supercharging, but when this was banned they had to redesign the unit. And while this machine is not as glamorous as the V4, it did have rather more luck, taking the inaugural 500cc World Championship. The Matchless Silver Hawk. The Silver Hawk is another V4 from AMC, but is a very different design to that of the AJS, making use of a narrow angle, just 26 degree V4 with all the cylinders in a single casting. The machine evolved from an earlier 400cc V-twin, the Silver Hawk. This machine used side valves, so was fairly underpowered and suffered a great deal from overheating. But the Silver Hawk engine was of 592cc and featured an overhead cam with bevel gearing. This obviously did improve performance, but it also allowed for better cooling around the barrels. The new engine was fitted into the Silver Arrow frame, which included rear suspension units not dissimilar to those you would find on later Yamaha RDs, or Vincent HRDs for that matter. Like its nearest competitor, the Ariel Square 4, the machine was never really intended as an out-and-out racer, but was instead a kind of early sports tourer, with a then not unreasonable top speed in the low 80s. And that V4 engine meant for great smoothness and great flexibility. But this was a rather expensive machine, consequently sales between 1931 and 1935 were only ever modest. The Yamaha RD 500. while early Grand Prix two-strokes had used square layouts. By the early 80s, the V4 was the engine to have in 500 Grand Prix, a fact demonstrated capably by Yamaha's YZR 500. However, in 1984, Yamaha made available the RD 500, effectively a replica of their Grand Prix bike for the road. The 90 horsepower V4 engine could be considered as essentially two 250 RDs on a common crankcase, although of course it was rather more complicated than that. The engine was in many ways typical sporting two-stroke and burbled along quite nicely if inoffensively below 6,000 RPM before really going for it above that, as the machine wailed its way towards its near 140 mph top speed. To help tame all this, there was an excellent chassis with anti-dive suspension and high quality components all round. The bike weighed in at 392 pounds or 198 kilos. The 50-degree V4 engine was of 499 cc's with a bore and stroke of 56.4 by 50. There was reed valve induction and the YPVS exhaust system. Compression ratio was a relatively modest 6.6 to 1 and peak horsepower was 88 horsepower at 9,500 RPM claimed. This gave the machine respectable acceleration, with a standing quarter-mile time of around 11.7 seconds. But for all its glamour and machismo, the RD was a slow seller, principally for three reasons. The engine had a reputation for vibration, and it was extremely thirsty, but worst of all, the machine was very expensive. Or perhaps the machine was just too single-minded for the tastes of 1980s riders. But whatever the reason, production ended in 1986 after just 2 years. The Honda RC30. There's no doubt that Honda got off to a rather sticky start with its early V4s, with a number of mechanical issues afflicting the early VFs. However, with the introduction of the VFR in 1986, Honda pretty much put all their problems behind them. Now in the early days, the VFR was a fairly successful race machine, however it soon became outclassed by the more aggressive competition rapidly appearing around it. But this is Honda of course, and they weren't going to allow the grass grow under their feet, and so 1988 saw the introduction of the RC30. Now the RC30 was not actually Honda's first racing V4, this had been the RVF, specifically designed for TT racing, which had first appeared a couple of seasons before and was extraordinarily exotic for a four-stroke machine of the period. And in fact the road-going RC30 was much closer to that machine than the VFR 750 Roadster. Like the VFR, the engine was a 90-degree V4, but was very different than the VFR. Similarly, it used 16 valves, but the crankshaft was completely different, using a 360-degree spacing rather than the 180 spacing of the VFR. And the engine components themselves were much more exotic, including forged titanium conrods, and the use of a close-ratio gearbox. But for all that, the machine wasn't actually that much more powerful than the standard VFR, with just an extra 7 horsepower claimed at 112 horsepower, and a top speed of around 155 miles an hour, a figure of course matched by later 600s, but this was very much a racer for the streets, and was capable of delivering much greater performance in race trim, which when coupled with that advanced chassis made the machine almost unbeatable in World Superbike in the early days, with Californian Fred Merkel winning back-to-back World Superbike titles in 88 and 89, a feat matched by Britain's Carl Fogarty in the Formula 1 TT class. The Yamaha VMAX. For me, motorcycles exist on a scale. There's the very sensible, let's call them most Hondas, then there's the badass variety of bikes, Kawasaki's quite often, but then there's the completely insane, and that's exactly where the VMAX sits. Take a very powerful V4, give it shaft drive, and stick it into a cruiser chassis. Of course, why not? And while the machine seems bonkers, the thinking behind it is anything but. This was a machine that remained in Yamaha's range for more than 2 decades after all. Not surprisingly, the VMAX was designed for the US market and was launched in 1985, where it made an immediate impact, largely due to that 1198cc direct overhead cam 16-valve V4 engine, which claimed a whopping 143 horsepower. Yamaha has essentially taken the 72-degree V4 engine from its Venture Tourer and given it hot cams, high compression pistons and bigger valves. and then just for good measure they added the V-boost system. Essentially this used a butterfly valve which was controlled to open at certain RPMs, allowing each cylinder to be fed by twin carburetors, taking the bike's performance from impressive to holy crap territory. And so badass was the reputation of the bike with the V-boost system, the Yamaha were not allowed to fit the system in some territories. Despite its cruiser appearance, the bike could get near 140 miles an hour top speed, assuming you had a really good screen or neck muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not surprisingly, another impressively large figure for the machine was its gross weight, tipping the scales at 273 kilos or nearly 600 pounds. But despite this, Yamaha's chassis does a reasonably good job of making the bike handle surprisingly well, all things considered. But push too hard and the bike will show you that it's no lightweight, and you will eventually of course run out of ground clearance. Yamaha would find that the bike's badass reputation would make it very much a cult classic, and a machine that would enjoy healthy sales right into the 21st century. The Honda Pan-European. Honda's Pan-European is different from all the other V4s we've mentioned in the video before, and is the very antithesis of the Grand Prix bikes, the race replicas, or even the crazy V-Maxes. In fact, the ST was conceived as a European version of the Goldwing, with its water-cooled overhead cam engine, running an inline crank and shaft final drive. The first version of the ST1100 arrived in 1990, and was of 1085 cc's and featured 4 valves per cylinder. Bore and stroke was 73 by 64.8, the compression ratio was a fairly lofty 10:1, and peak power was in and around 100 horsepower. So it was no super sport, but the engine was flexible and sophisticated, and handling despite the near 300 kg 650 pound weight was very good, making the bike a popular choice for paramedics and of course the police. The bodywork offered great protection, and the large tank gave a range of over 300 miles. The later ST1300 would arrive in 2002. It was more powerful and also lighter, with completely reworked styling, and this machine would last 11 years, running through until 2013. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Maybe you got a bike we can use for a test drive. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course thank you very much for watching.